Describing situations in detail helps readers more vividly understand what is taking place. When describing things in more detail, adverbs are a helpful addition to make your sentences more colorful and portray the event clearly. The easiest way to find an adverb in a sentence is to ask these questions. Where was something done? When was it done? How was it done? And to what extent was it done? An adverb will always answer one of those questions. For example, the adverb here answers the question, where? And the adverb randomly answers the question, how? An easy identifier for adverbs is the suffix ly. Not all adverbs use it, but the majority of adverbs do. Let's identify some adverbs by using our 4 questions. She went outside and walked the dog. Do any of those words in the sentence answer the question where, when, how, or to what extent? In this example, we see that outside is the adverb because it tells us where she went. Let's look at another. They briskly jogged through the park. Here, we see that the word briskly answers the question how something was done, making it the adverb in the sentence. Let's try one more example. She almost tripped while jogging, but regained her balance. This one might be tricky. In this example, we see that almost describes the extent to which something happens, which in this case was tripped. She almost tripped, making almost the adverb here. Adverbs not only modify verbs, they are also used to describe comparisons of 2 things. Adverbs have 3 degrees of comparison: positive, comparative, and superlative. The best way to explain positive, comparative, and superlative adverbs is to think of them as well, better, and best. When we want to describe the quality of something, we can say the thing itself is done well. That would be a positive adverb. We may compare that thing to something else and say, this thing is better than something else, which is known as a comparative adverb. Or we may simply say, this thing is the best, which is superlative. As you can see, with each comparison, the degree of its descriptor is increased. There are many ways of changing adverbs from positive to comparative and superlative. Let's go over each one with real examples and see how they differ. What's important to note about positive adverbs is that the words used don't necessarily have to be positive or good words. For example, the word badly is a positive adverb because it is the first or basic degree you can use to describe something without comparing it to anything else. Many adverbs can be modified to show different degrees by simply adding er or est to the end of the word. Adding er to a word makes it comparative, meaning it's not the most of something, but it is more than something else. Adding est to the end of a word means that the word it is describing is the most of something, and nothing can be compared as being better than it. Here's an example. He ran through the field faster than his sister. In this example, the adverb faster responds to the question of how something was done. We also know this is a comparative adverb because of the added er to the end of fast. This lets us know that this person ran at a higher speed compared to his sister. Here's another example. She was the quickest of everyone who ran the 5K. Here we see the adverb quickest answers the question of how something was done. Because there is an est at the end of quick, we know that this adverb is superlative because no one else ran more quickly than this person. Some adverbs, especially those that end in ly, can't have their degrees increased to comparative or superlative forms by simply adding er or est to the end. These adverbs must have more and most preceding the word to be modified. Let's look at a few examples. The crowd cheered for her more joyfully than for the other performers. Here we can see that joyfully is the adverb because it answers the question of how the crowd cheered. We can also see that joyfully is a comparative adverb because of the word more before it. With this, we know that the crowd cheered more, but not the most joyfully. He completed his task most efficiently of all the employees. Again, in this example, the adverb efficiently is easy to spot, not only because it ends in ly, but because it answers the question of how the task was performed. We also find the word most preceding efficiently, which means this is a superlative adverb and no task was completed more efficiently than his. Some adverbs can't be made comparative and superlative with the use of er, est, more, or most. For irregular adverbs, changing their degree of comparison means changing the word and its spelling entirely. There is no special trick to these irregular adverbs, so they must be memorized over time to understand their implied degree of comparison. The word badly is an example of an irregular adverb. To make it comparative, you wouldn't say more badly or badlier. The comparative form of badly is worse, and the superlative form is worst. Other examples of irregular adverbs include little, which becomes less and least, and good, which becomes better and best. Now, let's look at adverbial phrases. Adverbial phrases perform the same function as adverbs and describe when, how, to what extent, and where something happens. What makes them different from normal adverbs is they are phrases, which means they are a group of 2 or more words and they don't always contain a typical ly adverb in the phrase. Here are some examples that answer the question, when? He goes camping every summer. They are going to sleep earlier than usual. Here, these highlighted phrases signify a time in which something occurs. In this sentence, he was driving haphazardly and recklessly. This adverbial phrase is made up of 2 adverbs and a conjunction to make a phrase that describes how something occurred. An adverbial clause is similar to an adverbial phrase. However, adverbial clauses, just like the name suggests, are clauses, which means they contain a subject, verb, and subordinating conjunction. Let's look at some examples. Sit at the table until your food is eaten. In this example, the adverbial clause, until your food is eaten, describes when something occurs. We also know it is a clause because it has a subject, food, and verb, eaten, as well as a subordinating conjunction, until. My sister, although she was hungry, wouldn't eat until I arrived. Here, the adverbial clause starts with a subordinating conjunction, although has a subject, she, and a verb, is. Together, they describe the extent to which the sister wouldn't eat. Make sure you are polite to people wherever you go. This example shows the subordinating conjunction wherever, the subject you, and verb go to show when something happened. Before we go, let's do a little practice to refresh what we've learned. Number 1, which of the following are not adverbs? A, entirely, B, rather, C, them, or D, cautiously. The answer is C, them. The word them is a pronoun. Number 2, the highlighted word is an example of what? Some people agree that Serena Williams is the greatest athlete of all time. A, adverbial phrase, B, subordinating conjunction, C, comparative adverb, or D, superlative adverb. The answer is D, superlative.
Do you have hair that flows like a waterfall, or a hair that is as curly as a corkscrew? Are your eyes as blue as the ocean, or are your eyes brown like chocolate? These descriptions are all similes. Similes that may describe you. But what are similes exactly, and how are they used? Similes are a type of figurative language. Figurative language uses figures of speech to make written and verbal communication more effective, easier to understand, and more striking. Similes are a specific type of figurative language called imagery. There are several different types of imagery, but we'll stick with similes for this video. Similes use the words like or as to compare 2 unlike things. This comparison helps to bring out different qualities in the words, helping the audience to see the words in new ways. Some examples of similes used in everyday speech are, he is as strong as an ox. She can swim like a fish. The first simile uses the word as to compare a man to an ox. By comparing a man to an ox, you get the full impact of his strength. It would otherwise be flat and boring if you just said he was very strong. The second simile uses the word like to compare a woman to a fish. By doing this, you get a picture of how well she swims that a simple "she's a good swimmer" would not quite convey. Similes do not have to compare people to animals. There are many similes that compare a person to an object, or even one object to another. The clean tablecloth was as white as snow. The new car drove like a dream. As you can see, these items are not people or animals, but instead objects. However, these similes still use the word like or as to compare two unalike items. Having the word as appear twice in a simile can be confusing. It can be hard to tell what is being compared. Just remember to look for the noun in the sentence. What or who is being described? Comparing the tablecloth's color to snow helps the audience to see how white and clean it really is. Similes that use the word like are a bit easier. Driving the car is a positive experience, like a good dream. That comparison can evoke thoughts of a smooth ride, a fast drive, or even the wind blowing in your hair as you cruise along the beach. Such a simple simile can bring together so many new ideas. Similes are not just used in speech, however. Songs often use similes as well to make comparisons and draw attention to images and ideas, like the song Flying Trapeze by Alfred Lee and George Laybourne. Once I was happy, but now I'm forlorn, like an old coat that is tattered and torn. The writer of this song used the word like to compare being forlorn to an old coat. As silly as the song is, the image of the tattered and torn coat really helps to bring the depression of the singer to life. Without similes, many songs would seem lifeless and dull. Similes are also often used in poetry. In the poem A Red, Red Rose, Robert Burns uses a simile to describe his love. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. My love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. By comparing his love to both a rose, which is a symbol of love in many cultures, and also to a sweet melody, you get much more out of the poem than just love. The rose gives you color, red, the sweet scent of a rose, the soft velvetiness of its petals, and maybe even the sting of the rose's thorns. Like a rose, love can be complex and much more than just pretty. Melodies in music also have connotations of their own. Played in tune gives you an indication that things are going smoothly. Novels also use similes to bring characters and settings to life. An example of this occurs in Jane Austen's book Pride and Prejudice. The main love interest, Darcy, says, "I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love." By comparing poetry to food, you can see the importance he places on it. It is much more impactful to the reader than the character just stating that he finds poetry important in romance. This also helps to give us insight into his personality, making him a deeper, more well-rounded character. As you can see, similes help to make language more colorful and easier to understand. Similes help bring new color and life into mundane objects. They are an important part of songs, poetry, and even everyday speech. What similes do you use in your day-to-day speech? Or how can you spot similes in the things that you read or listen to?
I've told you to clean your room a million times. When I was your age, I had to walk 15 miles to school barefoot in the snow. Ever heard statements like that before? These are examples of an overstatement, or hyperbole, which is one of the things we'll be looking at in this video. We'll also be looking at the opposite of a hyperbole, an understatement, and how writers use these figures of speech to enhance their work. So, as you can tell from those two examples, a hyperbole is defined as obvious and intentional exaggeration. It's an extravagant statement or figure of speech that is not intended to be taken literally. We use hyperbole, or at least hear it, quite often in day-to-day conversation. For example, you might say to a friend, "I haven't seen you in an eternity." You saw this friend just last week, but to get the point across that it has felt like a long time, you exaggerate by using a word that implies it's been forever. Since this is an exaggeration and is not meant to be taken literally, it is a hyperbole. It is crucial to keep in mind that there are certain elements that make a hyperbole's function differ depending on context. In this case, the word eternity was used to create emphasis, but in a different situation, it could be used ironically. If you just recently saw your friend and coincidentally encountered him 20 minutes later, then making the same hyperbolic statement would have an ironic effect. Whether for emphasis or irony, hyperbole is never literal and is always an intentional and obvious exaggeration. Hyperbole is not just something that we use in conversation. Authors have used it as a literary tool for centuries. Take Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. The character Aegeus is in opposition to the relationship between his daughter and Demetrius, saying, "With cunning hast thou filched my daughter's heart." Obviously, Demetrius did not literally steal the blood-pumping organ from Aegeus's daughter. Saying that he has stolen her heart is an exaggerated way to imply that Aegeus is displeased with the situation. Here's a more recent example from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. Here, Vonnegut describes the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden during World War II. The hyperbolic sentence, "Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals," works to emphasize the destruction of the city after its bombing. This arguably has a much more powerful effect than simply saying, "Dresden was badly damaged." The hyperbole here may overstate the extent to which Dresden was damaged, but it drives the point home that the damage was extensive, perhaps difficult to put into language beyond the use of hyperbole for a reader who did not experience the bombing of the city as Vonnegut did in real life. So now that we've looked at hyperbole, let's flip things around and look at understatements. Instead of exaggerating, an understatement works by diminishing or minimizing the facts or situation at hand. Without context, these statements appear to be normal. Let's look at some examples. "I could have done a little better on the test." Without context, you might assume that this person did reasonably well on the test, perhaps scoring an 80 out of 100. However, if this person only made a 20 out of 100, his remark would be an understatement. He obviously could have done a lot better on the test. Other examples would be saying, "It rained a bit more than usual," after a storm that lasted an entire week, or saying, "We've had better games," after losing 70-0. Understatement, then, is often humorous and usually ironic. However, it can also be used sincerely in everyday speech for speakers to minimize or downplay the situation. Take the last example. The football player could be commenting on how terribly the game went in a humorous way, or he could be minimizing the importance of the loss in an attempt to distract from the terrible score so he could move on. Understatement is also used quite often in literature. Here's an example from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. "What, art thou hurt?" "Aye, a scratch, marry, 'tis enough. Where is my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon." In this scene, Mercutio has been mortally wounded. Understatement appears when he reduces his wound to a mere scratch. Understatement in this case can serve a few purposes. For one, it tells us something about Mercutio as a character. His willingness to call his severe wound a scratch suggests that he is courageous and stoic. Secondly, for readers or viewers of the play, this initial assessment of the wound may lead to the belief that it is not so severe. Thus, realizing later on that the wound is mortal may come as a more dramatic and powerful shock. Let's move into the 20th century with F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. Here, the extravagantly wealthy Tom Buchanan describes his place as merely nice. The latter description shows that the place is much more than nice, thus calling it such is an understatement. The understatement in this case could say a lot about Tom. He could be attempting to downplay the magnitude of his estate in order to avoid appearing like a braggart, or he may be so used to his wealthy lifestyle that he can only think of what most people would think of as extremely extravagant as nice. Okay, now that we've looked at overstatements and understatement, here's a review question to test your knowledge. Which is an example of hyperbole? A, the man was very tall. B, I would have liked to do a little better. C, the universe could be considered quite large. D, the spider was the size of a Buick. The correct answer is D. Though the spider may be large, saying it is the size of a car is an exaggeration.
Hi, and welcome to this video on thesis statements. A thesis statement is a sentence or two, usually found in the first paragraph of your paper, that briefly explains the purpose of the text, the argument you will be making, and the evidence you'll use to support it. Thesis statements are important because they act as an outline for the paper so the reader knows at a glance what the content of the paper will be. Before you write your thesis, a great deal of research on your potential topic must be done. This will allow you to fine-tune your argument with counter-arguments or evidence to make your thesis stronger. Let's look at some of the elements of a strong thesis statement. If you are provided with a prompt or question to answer, the thesis should clearly state your answer to that prompt. A thesis will have an identifiable perspective on the subject you are writing about. The reader will know your stance on the subject and how you will explain it in greater detail in the paper. Making your thesis a vague blanket statement will cause confusion for the reader. What are you actually writing about? Be specific about what your subject is and make sure your content thereafter follows your thesis. Here are some examples of good and bad thesis statements. Smoking is proven to negatively impact your health. This thesis is very broad. The writer didn't mention what they would talk about in regard to smoking. Do they agree? Will they counter this argument? What are the health risks? Why should the reader care about this subject? These are all questions that could make this thesis stronger. Let's try it again. Because of the health risks associated with smoking and unethical methods for harvesting tobacco, smokers should strive to quit the habit. In this example thesis, the writer is much more specific. They not only give their stance that smokers should quit smoking, but give 2 reasons why they should quit. Let's look at another example. Standardized tests are not useful for students. This sentence gives a stance, but it doesn't state what else the writer will say about standardized tests, nor does it mention evidence to support their statement that these tests are not useful. This could be a decent temporary thesis you can use until you do more research, but it needs more detail. Let's see what a strong example looks like. Standardized tests should not be the sole factor to determine a student's ability, because these tests have a history of bias, and using these scores alone can hinder students from potential educational opportunities. This thesis is very thorough. It not only gives the stance and tells what the paper will be about, but it also gives reasons to support their stance that they will talk about in detail later in the paper. Thesis statements are the solid foundation writers need to compose clear and detailed academic papers. Doing research and having your argument and supporting evidence planned out can help you fine-tune your thesis into a specific topic your readers can easily follow.
Hi, and welcome to this video on outlining. Today we will look at ways to create an outline in order to draw conclusions from a text. In particular, we will go over exactly what an outline is and why it is a useful organizational tool. Many people think of outlines as pre-writing tools used for structuring an essay. For instance, a thesis statement may be included along with 3 major supporting key points. However, the topic here is not primarily related to using outlines for the creation of an essay. Instead, we are concerned with using outlines to help us summarize and draw conclusions from a text. First off, it is crucial to gain an understanding of the conventional way of outlining. This will not only help you make a useful outline, it will also help you understand how to read an outline written by somebody else. However, do keep in mind that outlining is not a one-size-fits-all process. As you become more experienced with outlining, you may find that different methods work more effectively for you. For now, let's look at the essential pieces of an effective outline. At the top of your outline, be sure to write the thesis statement. The thesis statement is often included at the beginning of a text. In an essay, it may be the final sentence of the first paragraph, while for a shorter passage, it may be the first sentence. In essence, the thesis statement should be the biggest idea. It is an idea that all following ideas in the text relate back to. Roman numerals denote main ideas throughout a text. In particular, these are primary ideas or claims. They make up the main substance of the text. Think of these portions as the ideas that the author wants you as a reader to take away after reading. The number of Roman numerals in an outline relies on how many main ideas are present in the text. Uppercase letters denote subtopics in a text. In short, subtopics provide support for main ideas. These can be thought of as secondary ideas or claims. These are crucial for justifying and supporting the primary ideas or claims in a text. Arabic numbers are used to denote subdivisions within subtopics. To put it more simply, these are used when listing claims or ideas that support secondary claims or ideas. Lowercase letters are details within subdivisions. One rule to keep in mind while outlining is that there is a flow from general to specific ideas. For instance, main ideas as denoted by Roman numerals are relatively broad, while content following lowercase letters can be quite specific. Let's look at a simple sample outline. There are a couple of things to note about this outline. First, not every main idea listed has the same number of corresponding subtopics. Furthermore, not every subtopic has a subdivision. This is okay. The number of main ideas, subtopics, subdivisions, and details about subdivisions will vary depending on how detailed you want your outline to be. Another important aspect to consider is the order of the outline.
There's a reason that 1, smoking is unhealthy, appears first. It is arguably the most important reason to avoid smoking, while the other main ideas may not be considered as urgent. Learning how to create a conventional outline can be very beneficial for drawing conclusions and summarizing the content of a text. Let's look at a review question before we go. Which of the following statements is false? A. Outlines help us organize ideas about a text. B. There's only one proper way to do an outline. C. Outlines proceed from general ideas or claims to specific ideas and claims. Or D. An outline generally uses Roman numerals to list main ideas. The answer is B. There is no one proper way to create an outline. Use whatever methods work best for you.
Every essay or paper is made up of 3 main sections: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Today, we're going to look specifically at body paragraphs and learn what they're used for and how to write them. Imagine your essay was a meal. Now, think of your body paragraphs as the main course. Your introduction is an appetizer that briefly describes what your main idea of the text will be about, and the conclusion is the dessert that nicely wraps up everything you talked about. Meanwhile, your body paragraphs hold the bulk of the information and supporting details about your main idea. But how do you go about creating these paragraphs? Let's take a look at how a body paragraph is structured. The first sentence of a body paragraph starts with an introduction or transition. This can be a phrase or sentence that tells the reader what the main point of this paragraph will be. Here's an example. Though diets are a popular form of weight loss, many diets have been proven to be unsafe ways to lose weight. In this example, the first sentence argues that some diets aren't safe. This introductory statement lets the reader know that the rest of the paragraph should be about how diets can be unsafe. This is where the supporting details and evidence come in to support the topic sentence. Let's look back at our example. Many diets claim to help people lose weight fast. However, losing too much weight too quickly can do more harm to your body than good. Losing too much weight too fast from dieting can lead to muscle loss, gallstones, and nutritional deficiencies. According to many experts, losing 1 to 2 pounds per week is a safe rate to lose weight. Here, the sentences following the introduction go into detail about how diets can be dangerous and why. It also gives data to support this argument. Lastly, the paragraph should wrap up with a conclusion sentence that ties up the main point. You should always be wary of diets that promise fast results or don't encourage regular exercise as part of the routine. In this example, we've wrapped up the paragraph by telling the reader to take the information they've just read and apply it to their own life. After you conclude your first body paragraph, you can reuse this system as many times as possible until you have enough body paragraphs to cover all the main points of your thesis for your paper. Okay, let's review before we go. In an essay, body paragraphs come in between the introduction and conclusion. These paragraphs will flesh out your main ideas and provide supporting details to back them up. Finally, a body paragraph should start with an introduction and end with some sort of conclusion or transition to the next paragraph.
As we are reading a story, whether we realize it or not, we are making predictions. This is particularly the case when we are reading actively instead of passively. Reading actively means that we are engaged with the text fully and immersed in its world. Our thinking about that fictional world allows us to come up with possible outcomes, meaning we use textual evidence to make predictions. Today we'll be looking at 2 types of predictions and how to best make predictions while you're reading. We'll be looking at 2 basic kinds of predictions: predictions based on our knowledge of how literature works, and predictions based on information the text has already given us. The first type uses a slightly different way of looking at literature than the second. Though there is a lot of literature out there, there are often ideas or basic tropes that remain constant, or at least common, throughout most works. For instance, we understand how protagonists work and how they deal with conflict. We also know about the basic structure of plots in novels and stories. What are some of the implications of this in terms of making predictions? Number 1, answers are rarely given at the beginning of a story. Number 2, looking at where you are in a story or book will give you a good idea as to how soon the climax will occur. Number 3, literature tends to influence other literature. Think of how many works have similar endings, character developments, etc. Number 4, think of genres and how their conventions differ. Mystery novels, Shakespearean comedies, and science fiction works all have different general rules. These 4 basic principles allow us to make predictions simply by understanding the basic structure and conventions of different kinds of literature. For example, after reading 1 or 2 Jane Austen novels, you will likely be able to predict how future works by Austen will end. You can go further and apply this to romance novels in general, as they have been deeply influenced by the rules and conventions created by Austen. Now let's look at our other type of prediction making, predicting based on information in the text. One of the tools many authors use in their writing, which is helpful when making predictions, is foreshadowing. Defined simply, foreshadowing is a literary device used by authors that hints at developments occurring later on in the story. Some forms of foreshadowing are more direct. They are obvious or ironic statements that let readers know what is likely to happen. However, sometimes the author may use subtle foreshadowing, which usually consists of clues that don't become apparent until after the foreshadowed event comes to pass. In this case, you can look at an event in the text and think back to what previously happened and almost say, I should have seen it coming. Let's look at an example of direct foreshadowing. Lauren Oliver's Before I Fall contains a clear example of direct foreshadowing in the very first sentence of the book, as the narrator states, "They say that just before you die, your whole life flashes before your eyes, but that's not how it happened for me." Here we know from context that the narrator must be dead. However, we know that the narrator's life did not pass before her eyes, as it's known to happen. Therefore, the phrase, "That's not how it happened to me," makes readers ask, well, how did it happen to you? This kind of direct foreshadowing works to make readers want to continue reading in order to find an answer to the question posed. You can make predictions by thinking outside the box here, as the information suggests that the narrator will not experience a normal death. Another example occurs in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. In Chapter 7, Bilbo and his band of dwarves enter Mirkwood Forest and are warned several times about straying from the main path by the character Bjorn. The final warning is written as such: "Be good, take care of yourselves, and don't leave the path." First, the fact that this is mentioned several times before Bjorn's final warning makes it pretty obvious foreshadowing. And the fact that Bjorn's final warning is in all caps drives home the point. We can infer from all of this that there is danger if Bilbo and company stray from the path, and perhaps more importantly, that they will in fact stray from the path. We can reasonably conclude this because otherwise discussing the path so often would be a waste of space. For an example of subtle foreshadowing, let's look at Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. "Tut, man, one fire burns out, another's burning. One pain is lessened by another's anguish. Turn giddy and be helped by backward turning. One desperate grief cures with another's languish. Take thou some new infection to thy eye, and the rank poison of the old will die." In this dialogue, Benvolio is advising Romeo, who is in love with Rosaline at this point, to fall in love with another in order to cure himself of his infatuation. There are a few things going on here. First, we see Romeo deeply in love with Rosaline. In this way, his future mad love for Juliet is foreshadowed in a subtle manner. But even more subtle here is the reference to rank poison. The rank poison of his love for Rosaline does in fact pass once he meets and falls in love with Juliet. But it is this love that ultimately leads him to literally die by poisoning himself. Unlike the previous examples of direct foreshadowing, it would be difficult for readers to piece this together until after reading the play. Then in future readings, or just by thinking back to this dialogue after a first reading, these lines become all the more powerful. In terms of making predictions, it is often much easier to focus on direct foreshadowing. Let's take a look at some useful aspects for understanding foreshadowing and making predictions. First, be on the lookout for what's known as Chekhov's gun. A Russian writer, Anton Chekhov, insisted on getting rid of all unnecessary elements in his works so as to leave nothing hanging or unexplained at the end. He said, "If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there." Though this is not always true, you will find that many writers follow this rule. You can actually see this used in the previous example from The Hobbit. Warning Bilbo to avoid straying from the path would be an unneeded thing to repeat and emphasize if he weren't going to eventually leave the path. Then again, there's also the red herring. A red herring is a literary device that misleads the reader. It is essentially a dead end. Red herrings are often used in mystery novels in order to build suspense and hold off on revealing the actual suspect too early. Secondly, be mindful of genre. Different genres have different rules and conventions. For instance, we know from reading mystery novels or watching Law and Order that the obvious suspect is rarely the correct one. Therefore, we can make predictions about the actual culprit based on this knowledge. Works of science fiction, similarly, often include plot twists. Things aren't quite what they seem until we read further. Therefore, being suspicious of the obvious is one means of making predictions, or at least one way to avoid making incorrect predictions. This is where using other works to make predictions comes into the picture. We can make predictions by thinking about how other works in a particular genre have functioned. The more mystery novels you read, the better you will become at predicting the culprit. The more Shakespearean tragedies you read, the easier it will be for you to make thoughtful predictions about the ending. Though not all events in a text can be effectively predicted, foreshadowing often offers a way for readers to logically piece together a story's outcome. Reading carefully and looking for possible instances of foreshadowing is one strategy for making these sorts of informed predictions. Now, before we go, here's a review question to test your knowledge. Which of the following is an example of a red herring? A suspect initially thought to be the murderer ends up being innocent. B, a warning from a psychic comes true. C, a character enters a place that he is warned about and faces conflict. Or D, Katniss takes Primrose's place in the Hunger Games. The correct answer is A. Put simply, regional geography is a branch of geography that studies the world's regions. A region itself is defined as a part of the Earth's surface with one or many similar characteristics that make it unique from other areas. Today, we're going to look at various types of regional geography found throughout the world. Let's start with North America. Located between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in the northern part of the Western Hemisphere, North America is home to roughly 579 million people. The continent is full of a large variety of natural resources, including great mineral wealth, vast forests, immense quantities of fresh water, and some of the world's most fertile soils. Being the third largest continent, it spans almost every known climate zone, from hot equatorial in the southern tip of Central America to the frozen tundra of northern Canada. To simplify things, North America can be physically divided into 5 regions: the mountainous West, the Great Plains, the Canadian Shield, the varied Eastern region, and the Caribbean. The West consists mainly of 3 young mountain chains: the Cascades, the Rocky Mountains, and the Sierra Madre Mountains, and 3 deserts formed by rain shadows: the Mojave, the Sonoran, and the Chihuahuan. The Great Plains consist of a massive grassland prairie forming much of the interior of the continent, with fertile soils producing food that feeds much of the world. The world's largest and most destructive tornadoes are also found here. The Canadian Shield is a plateau extending over eastern and northwestern Canada, characterized by numerous lakes and a permafrost due to its tundra climate. The varied eastern region consists of the Atlantic coastal plain along the eastern coast and the resource-rich Appalachian Mountains just inland from the Atlantic Ocean. Within the Atlantic coastal plain lies large riparian and wetland biomes, most notable of which are the Florida Everglades. The Caribbean region includes more than 7,000 islands, islets, reefs, and cays within the Caribbean Sea between North and South America. Moving south, let's look at South America. The South American continent lies in the Western Hemisphere and is divided politically into 12 independent countries. Together, these countries have a combined population of more than 420 million. Due to climate here ranging from equatorial to tundra and everything in between, South America can be divided into 4 main landforms: mountains, highlands, river basins, and coastal plains. Mountains and coastal plains generally run in a north-south direction, while highlands and river basins generally run in an east-west direction, with extreme geographic variation contributing to the continent's large number of biomes. Beginning in the north and containing the tallest peaks outside of Asia, the Andes are the longest mountain chain in the world, reaching 4,349 miles down the western length of South America. Next is the Amazon River, known as the second longest river in the world after the Nile River. Flowing through the Amazon rainforest across the width of the complex Amazon River Basin watershed, this river drains the Amazon rainforest, which covers much of the interior of Brazil, parts of the Andes, and reaches into the Brazilian highlands. At an average elevation of 3,280 feet above sea level, the Brazilian highlands cover about 1.9 million square miles in eastern, central, and southern Brazil, with the incredibly arid Atacama Desert located in the Chilean Andes at the southwestern part of the continent. To note, coastal plains can be found along most of the continent across several of the climate zones. Let's move a bit northeast and look at Europe. Positioned south of the Arctic Ocean, east of the Atlantic Ocean, and north of the Mediterranean Sea, Europe receives a multitude of climates, from Mediterranean to taiga across its length. Technically composed of the westernmost peninsula of the Eurasian landmass and associated islands, Europe has always been considered as its own continent, with the most commonly agreed upon continental boundaries of Eastern Europe following the Ural Mountains and the Ural River in Russia, continuing through the Caspian Sea and into the Black Sea. With these qualifiers in mind, Europe can be rated the second smallest continent by landmass. With 741.4 million people, the continent, excluding Russia, contains less than 10% of the world's total population. It is known, however, to be incredibly developed and supports high densities of population concentrated in urban industrial regions. Notable physical features include the English Isles to the northwest and the Swiss Alps in the southwest, as well as over 50 rivers that cross the region. Most prominent of these are the Rhine, Elbe, Oder, Danube, and Dnieper rivers. Many areas of Western Europe have a moderate climate, while areas of the south predominantly feature a warm, dry Mediterranean climate. Currently, Russia is the largest country on the planet, spanning the width of northern Asia and the eastern third of Europe. Despite its massive size, estimates calculate the current population at roughly 145.9 million people, a mere 1.89% of the world's total population. In order to define this area, geographers traditionally divide the vast territory of Russia into 5 natural zones: the tundra zone, the taiga or forest zone, the steppe or plains zone, the arid zone, and the mountain zone. Within these zones exists several smaller delineations, including the East European and West Siberian plains, 2 lowlands, the North Siberian and the Kolyma in far northeastern Siberia, the Central Siberian Plateau, the Lena Plateau to its east, and 2 sets of mountainous areas. Russia also contains Europe's longest river, the Volga, and its largest lake, Ladoga. Moving south now, Central Asia stretches from the Caspian Sea in the west to China in the east, and from Afghanistan and Iran in the south to Russia in the north. The region consists of the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. It contains a total population of 107.5 million people, mostly located in urban hubs or small herding communities. Much of this arid region makes up the eastern portion of the Eurasian steppe, covering an immense range of geographic extremes from permafrost to desert, and many in between, with freshwater considered a limited resource. As such, rivers remain the lifeblood of both this region and Southwest Asia, often leading to contested control of said resource by surrounding countries. Despite the geopolitical disagreements prevalent in this region, the area of Southwest Asia can be divided into 3 subregions spanning 18 countries, containing a total population of 275.3 million people. The first subregion, known as the Arabian Peninsula, is bordered by the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and Persian Gulf. Deserts cover most of this area, following the trend in arid subtropical climates at this latitude. The second subregion found here is the Anatolian Peninsula. It is the home of modern-day Turkey, with the Black Sea to the north and Mediterranean Sea to the southwest. This peninsula represents the northernmost extension of Southwest Asia. The third and final region is the Plateau of Iran, which is bordered by the Persian Gulf to the southwest and Caspian Sea in the north. Although much of Southwest Asia is arid or semi-arid, it does have some areas with adequate rainfall. Along the Mediterranean coast and across most of Turkey, hot summers and rainy winters, like those in Southern California, create a good climate for growing citrus fruits, olives, and vegetables. South Asia can loosely be described as the 8 nations around the Indian subcontinent, including Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, and Pakistan, as well as the island nations of Sri Lanka and the Maldives, situated south of India. With a population numbering approximately 1.9 billion, South Asia is the most densely populated geographical region in the world, accounting for 24% of the total human population, even though it only occupies approximately 3% of the world's land area. At this subcontinent's southern border lies the Indian Ocean, with the Great Himalayas to the northeast and the Hindu Kush Mountains to the northwest, separating the Indian Plate from the rest of continental Asia. To note, the tallest peak in the world, Mount Everest, can be found here in Nepal. To simplify the region, South Asia can be largely divided into 4 broadly interconnected climate zones. The northern Indian edge and Pakistani uplands have a dry, subtropical continental climate. The Himalayas have an alpine climate. The far south of India and southwest Sri Lanka have an equatorial climate, and most of the Indian peninsula experiences a gradient of tropical climates. The climate in this region is heavily influenced by monsoons, which bring alternating periods of wet and dry weather, with 70 to 90% of the region's precipitation falling during the warm monsoon season. Located on the western edge of the Pacific Ocean, the countries of China, Japan, Mongolia, North Korea, and South Korea cover a 4.57 million square miles in the region known as East Asia. The temperate climate here is comparable to Europe or North America, with the exception that most rainfall occurs during the warm seasons following the monsoon winds from the south. Within this area lies many climate regions rich in natural resources, from mountains, steppe lands, plateaus, and deserts in the north and west to the fertile river valleys and deltas in the southern portions and near the coasts. Southeast Asia consists of the area east of the Indian subcontinent, south of China, and north of Australia, covering 1.73 million square miles of land and another 3.26 million square miles of ocean. Further divided into two subregions, mainland Southeast Asia consists of the countries of Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar or Burma, part of Malaysia, and the small city-state of Singapore at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. South of this point is known as Insular Southeast Asia, containing Indonesia, the second half of Malaysia, Borneo, Brunei, and the Philippines. Southeast Asia experiences tropical and subtropical climates with seasonal wet-dry periods. Bordered by the Pacific and Indian Oceans, precipitation is received in the form of regularly occurring monsoons, which follow the shift in direction of the prevailing winds approximately every 6 months. Due to its position on the Sunda Plate near the intersection of several other tectonic plates, Southeast Asia became dominated by a series of mountain ranges, plains, and plateaus that form complex drainage systems. To note, this topography tends to create many localized microclimates within the larger environment. Rice and fish are traditional food staples in both Southeast and East Asia, with rural agricultural communities continuing to make up a large portion of the population of these countries. The main exception to this population trend would be Japan, which is highly urbanized throughout most of the island nation. Now let's move southwest a bit and take a look at Africa. North Africa contains the modern countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, with Egypt and Sudan technically being shared with the Southwest Asian region. In the present day, North Africa is associated with West Asia in the realm of geopolitics to form a Middle East North Africa region and is home to roughly 243 million people. Bordered to the north by the Mediterranean Sea, North Africa has three main geographic features: the Sahara Desert in the south, the Atlas Mountains in the west, and the Nile River and Delta in the east. The Sahara is the largest hot desert in the world, covering 75% of the entire region, with sand temperatures reaching 176 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. It serves as the shared boundary of North Africa and the sub-Saharan Africa, covering a variety of arid regions from volcanoes, mountains, and plateaus to salt flats and sand seas. The Atlas Mountains are part of a resource-rich fold mountain system spanning 1,600 miles into southern Europe at the northernmost point, but recedes to the south and east, becoming a steppe landscape before meeting the Sahara. This environment is mostly arid, with most fertile areas located along the north and west coastlines of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. On the eastern side of North Africa lies the 4,130-mile-long Nile River and associated Nile Delta, which are considered the most fertile growing regions of northern Africa. Historically supporting the growth of large civilizations, with ancient Egypt being among the most notable, this watershed crosses the entire Sahara and exits into the Mediterranean Sea in the north. The areas immediately surrounding the Nile River experience seasonal flooding that rejuvenate the soils with silt and natural fertilizers sourced from the lakes and mountains further south in the continent. Climate around the river can be characterized as a humid combination of subtropical and Mediterranean, depending on latitude, with about 80% average humidity. Making up the entire southern half of the African continent, Sub-Saharan Africa is home to 14.22% of the world's population, which roughly comes out to 1.07 billion people. There is a swath of climates present across this region, including desert, semi-arid, tropical, and equatorial, each of which contains its own unique plant and animal communities. Although this southern portion of Africa contains steppes and plateaus, it lacks the extended mountain chains found in the northern part of the continent and most other continental land masses. To simplify things, sub-Saharan Africa can be split into 7 major physical subregions: the Sahel, the Ethiopian highlands, the savanna, the Swahili coast, the rainforest, the African Great Lakes, and southern Africa. The South Sahara marks the northern border of sub-Saharan Africa, which transitions into the semi-arid boundary zone known as the Sahel. This zone stretches across the south-central latitudes of northern Africa between the Atlantic Ocean and the Red Sea, distinctly separating the Sahara from the savanna grasslands and demonstrating traits from each. The savanna covers about half of Africa, surrounding a portion of the centrally located Congo rainforest basin. It is bounded by the mountainous north-south running Ethiopian highlands to the east and the agriculturally depleted sandy Swahili coast to the southeast. The Atlantic Ocean and Kalahari Desert lie to the west and southwest, respectively, with the 2.6 billion-year-old shelf of bedrock known as the Kapval Craton creating the southern boundary. This shelf is generally known as South Africa and exists as the epicenter of Africa's well-known endangered animal reserves. Dispersed among all of these lie the African Great Lakes, which contain a diverse range of microclimates throughout their subregions. These first 2 subregions cover large bands of the continent, while others, such as the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lakes, are fairly constrained in their area. Finally, let's look at Australia and Oceania. Oceania refers to some 10,000 islands covering about 317,700 square miles of actual landmass in the South Pacific Ocean, including Papua New Guinea and New Zealand. Many of the islands have large mountains on them, as the majority were produced by volcanic activity or uplift from the collision of continental plates, with the tallest peaks located in New Zealand reaching up to 12,000 feet in elevation. Near the latitude of 23 degrees south, these islands experience tropical climates year-round, moderated by the southern trade winds. Due to the range of species that thrive in the temperate and tropical rainforests found on the islands throughout this region, it is categorized as one of the world's largest biodiversity hotspots of both flora and fauna. Although both Australia and Oceania experience typhoon-level storms out of the South Pacific, Oceania historically receives a greater quantity than any other area on the planet. This, in turn, results in a harsh environment for plants, animals, and native peoples among the island chains. Communities affected the most are those who rely on fishing and small-scale farming of cassava, taro, yams, and sweet potatoes for their economies, as well as boats for daily travel or emergency medical care. In contrast with Oceania, Australia is 2.97 million square miles of landmass, located at the center of the Indo-Australian plate, away from most island-creating processes. Arid desert dominates much of the interior and western side of this continent, with industrial centers being clustered along the coasts and within the eastern fertile fringe of the island, where the more humid environment allows for ideal growing conditions to occur. Despite being considered the urban center for this region of the world, there are still many native Aboriginal peoples living in the northern half of this continent that maintain a hunter-gatherer way of life on their ancestral lands.
The Bill of Rights is the name given to the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. But even though we're only just a few seconds into this video, we have a problem. That's because the name Bill of Rights is a bit of a misnomer. To understand why, we have to travel back in time to Philadelphia in 1787. In the hot and buggy summer, the Constitutional Convention is meeting. Delegates from every state, except Rhode Island, are meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation, the governing document that bound the states together at the time. The Constitution hasn't been written yet, let alone ratified. Some argued that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate, and so the delegates were meeting to fix the problems, although a few of the delegates wished to start over from scratch. Towards the very end of the convention, George Mason motioned to have a Bill of Rights included, but was overruled. To many delegates, it wasn't necessary. The states already protected individual rights, and the Constitution they were writing did not take away any rights. But this motion became a rallying cry for a group known as the Anti-Federalists, who opposed the new Constitution. Someone writing under the pseudonym Cincinnatus made the case for a Bill of Rights in a letter to his political opponent, James Wilson. He used the example of freedom of the press to drive his point home. Wilson had previously written on the matter using a similar argument to what I said previously, that the power to limit citizens' freedoms was not granted to the federal government, so stating that certain rights were reserved for the citizens was unnecessary. Cincinnatus argued that the particulars of the powers that were granted to the federal government were important. He wrote, quote, "For instance, the proposed Congress are empowered to define and punish offenses against the laws of nations. Mark well, sir, if you please, to define and punish. Can anyone even think that does not comprehend a power to define and declare all publications from the press against the conduct of government, in making treaties, or in any other foreign transactions, an offense against the law of nations?" End quote. Cincinnatus hypothesized thus: suppose a certain printer earned the wrath of a government official for criticizing treaties or the like. Without a Bill of Rights, it would be easy for the government to silence this printer and, quote, "the freedom of the press, the sacred palladium of public liberty, would be pulled down. All useful knowledge on the conduct of government would be withheld from the people. The press would become subservient to the purposes of bad and arbitrary rules, and imposition, not information, would be its object." End quote. But here's why the term Bill of Rights is perhaps not an entirely accurate name. The Constitution was not written to place extensive limits on individual freedom. Alexander Hamilton argued forcefully against them in the Federalist Papers, a series of essays he and two other delegates wrote in support of ratifying the Constitution. In Federalist number 84, he says this, quote, "I go further and affirm that Bill of Rights, in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? Why, for instance, should it be said that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed? I will not contend that such a provision would confer a regulating power, but it is evident that it would furnish, to men disposed to usurp, a plausible pretense for claiming that power." End quote. Hamilton argued that the Constitution gave the federal government limited powers, which did not include curbing free speech or limiting a free press. This meant that no provision in the Constitution specifically delineating or articulating this right was necessary. For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? This would be like a parent telling their children they were not allowed to fly around in the backyard. Well, obviously, because people cannot fly independently. The Bill of Rights are rules against doing something the government didn't have power to do in the first place. But despite Hamilton's fears, a Bill of Rights was added onto the Constitution in the form of the first 10 amendments. James Madison originally drafted a number of amendments to the Constitution. He was influenced by existing state constitutions, the Magna Carta of 1215 and the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The House of Representatives approved 17 articles in August of 1789, and the Senate approved a slightly different list of 12 the next month. The House then agreed upon that list, and 12 amendments were put before the states to ratify. They ratified 10 of the 12 on December 15, 1791. Another one became the 27th Amendment in 1992. The remaining amendment has been ratified by some of the states, but not by enough to pass. Technically, should enough states choose to ratify that proposal, it would also become an amendment, although it would create thousands of additional representatives in the House. since it ties the number of representatives to 1 for every 50,000 citizens. Well, that has brought us back to the present and concludes our overview of the history of the Bill of Rights. You are welcome to leave now if you really want, but I'm going to read the Bill of Rights in just a moment. Hope you stick around and enjoy. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment 3. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Amendment 4. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, and the persons or things to be seized. Amendment 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Amendment 7. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Amendment 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Amendment 9. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Keep in mind that every single one of these amendments has been litigated and interpreted in different ways, so while what you read here is the best place to start, your intuitive understanding may not line up with current legislation or court interpretation. But keep in mind that these amendments are an important limit on the scope and workings of the federal government.
Today, we'll be looking at an overview of the origins, key events, and themes of the Second World War. This won't just be a summary of the war in Europe, we'll be also looking at the Pacific theater and the importance of the home front, how entire societies were mobilized to sustain such a monumental war effort, and we'll also briefly look at the key outcomes and how they shaped the world as we know it today. To begin, let's quickly remind ourselves of the highlights of World War I. Put simply, the world's major powers fought a grueling war of attrition from 1914 to 1918. It was a global conflict, but the most important theater of the war was the Western Front. Two opposing lines of trenches stretched across Western Europe. After suffering heavy losses, the Allies finally triumphed over the Central Powers. The fighting came to an end on November 11, 1918, when the German Empire signed an armistice with Britain, France, and the United States. After several months of negotiation, the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919. For the defeated Germans, the treaty seemed harsh and caused years of bitter resentment. They were forced to accept responsibility for causing the war and required to pay huge reparations. For the French, the treaty was quite lenient, and a German revival was the cause of a great deal of anxiety. Ferdinand Foch, a French general, famously declared that Versailles was not a peace, but a 20-year armistice. And he was right. The years following World War I were a bleak period of European history, particularly in Germany. The humiliation of Versailles and a global economic downturn caused hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and political violence. These were the conditions which allowed extremist voices to be heard, and in January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within a year, Hitler and the Nazi Party consolidated power. Promising to revive German fortunes, Hitler pursued an aggressive foreign policy to undo Versailles and to make Germany self-sufficient. The idea of Lebensraum, which means living space, was to greatly expand German territory in Eastern Europe. Above all else, he opposed what he saw as the threat of Jewish Bolshevism and saw the defeat of the Soviet Union as his destiny. Hitler's foreign policy was a series of gambles with increasingly escalating stakes. In 1936, he ordered the reoccupation of the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized by Versailles. The German army was under orders to withdraw at the first sign of resistance, but none came. That same year, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, gained combat experience by supporting the nationalist side in the Spanish Civil War. Believing the French and the British did not have the stomach for another fight, Hitler's demands increased. The Anschluss, the joining of Germany and Austria under German rule, took place on March 12, 1938. Hitler then demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, a region with 3 million Germans. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, met with Hitler in September 1938 to hash out a peaceful solution to the Sudetenland crisis. An agreement was reached, and Chamberlain claimed he had secured peace in our time. Less than 6 months later, though, the remainder of the Czech state was annexed by Hitler. From 1936 to 1938, Hitler successfully sought out reoccupation efforts, taking possession of the Rhineland, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Still not satisfied, Hitler pressed for yet more territorial concessions and succeeded in claiming Memel from Lithuania in March 1939. Once again, the British and French failed to oppose Hitler's brazen demands, and by the summer, Hitler turned his attention to the port city of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk. In August, to the great surprise of the rest of the world, Germany agreed to a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, essentially agreeing to carve up Poland. Danzig was a majority German territory which had been ceded to Poland by the Treaty of Versailles. Seeking yet another bloodless victory, Hitler demanded the Poles hand over Danzig to reconnect East Prussia with Germany. This ended up being one demand too many, and with French and British support, the Poles refused. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Hitler's hopes of keeping the war localized between Germany and Poland were dashed when the British and French declared war on September 3rd. The Poles resisted fiercely, but were outmatched by the German army, and a bad situation became worse when the Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17th. Poland fell after a month of fighting, caught in an utterly hopeless strategic position between two hostile powers. The Allies did very little to assist the Poles. Hitler had gambled on a quick victory in Poland and left the German border with France lightly defended. An Allied attack would probably have succeeded, but the experience of such catastrophic losses in World War I made the Allies reluctant to go on the offensive. After the fall of Poland, very little fighting took place in Europe in the winter of 1939 to 1940. The French did not want another war inside France and to bear the brunt of the casualties as they had done in World War I. The plan was to do much of the fighting in the Low Countries and to avoid heavy casualties. The British dispatched an army to assist the French, and the expectations from the Allies, and indeed most of the world, was another long war of attrition. Apparently, the Germans did not get the memo. Fretting about fighting another lengthy war for which they were not prepared, the German High Command spent the winter of 1939-1940 trying to find a way to achieve a quick victory. A bold plan devised by Erich von Manstein proposed a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest to cut off the Allied army in Belgium. The plan succeeded beyond even the wildest dreams of the Germans. Believing the area to be impassable, it was the weakest section of the Allied line and no match for the main thrust of the German attack. The Allies were slow to respond and allowed a local setback to become a catastrophic defeat. The British Army narrowly escaped complete annihilation at Dunkirk thanks to a frantic evacuation that whisked over 300,000 soldiers back to Britain in 8 days. With France on the brink of defeat, Italy opportunistically entered the war on June 10, 1940, hoping to gain a share of the German spoils. 2 weeks later, the French capitulated and Britain stood alone against the Axis. The English Channel was all that separated the Germans from complete victory. English calls to reach a settled peace were rebuffed by the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority over Britain to make an invasion possible, waging an aerial campaign over the skies of England in the summer of 1940. The Royal Air Force was aided enormously by the development of radar technologies to detect incoming planes and the bravery of a large number of foreign pilots. In fact, more than 500 pilots from across the world aided Britain during her darkest hour, 400 of which were from Poland, New Zealand, Canada, and Czechoslovakia. Ultimately, the RAF prevailed and the German plan for an invasion of Britain was cancelled. Let's leave Europe for a moment and turn our attention to the war as it played out in the Pacific. It's generally accepted that the German invasion of Poland was the start of World War II, but hostilities had broken out in Asia some years before. The Second Sino-Japanese War began on July 7, 1937, with the Japanese invasion of China. Japan had fought on the Allied side of World War I, honoring an alliance with Britain. The Japanese experience of the First World War was quite minor compared to the horrific losses endured by the other sides. German territories in Asia and the Pacific were easily seized with few casualties. In the years following the war, the Japanese political landscape altered to a militarized, ultranationalist outlook known as Showa statism, effectively Japanese fascism. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria following the Mukden Incident, an event used as a pretext for the invasion by the Japanese army. In 1937, with tensions running high between China and Japan, a clash between troops near Beijing on July 7th escalated into a full-blown war. The Chinese capital of Nanjing was captured in December of 1937 and subjected to a massacre so severe that it continues to place a strain on Sino-Japanese relations to this very day. Despite the losses and large portions of territory taken away, the Chinese refused to give in, and the Japanese simply didn't have the manpower to subdue the entire country by force. Japan's diplomatic standing was damaged by the war with China and led to a series of trade restrictions with the United States. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany, bringing the nations into a loose alliance as the Axis powers. A lack of natural resources meant that Japan was dependent on foreign trade, primarily from the United States. A failure to reach a settlement saw the US cut Japan off completely in August 1941. A lack of oil was a major problem for the Axis powers, and would lead to some disastrous decisions. Now, back to Europe. Hitler made the fateful decision to break the non-aggression pact with Russia and launched an invasion on June 22, 1941. Hitler believed that after overcoming the Russian forces on the border, the Red Army would crack. He said, quote, "We need only kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down," end quote. Operation Barbarossa was initially successful. The German army encircled and destroyed several Russian divisions while advancing hundreds of miles. But Hitler had drastically underestimated the lengths the Soviets would go to for survival. 1,500 military factories were dismantled and reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains and out of reach of the German military. Workers labored 16 hours a day to dramatically increase war production to previously unimaginable levels. The Red Army suffered enormous losses in men and material, but actually grew in size as the war went on. 30 million men would be conscripted by the Red Army from 1941 to 1945. 1941 was also the year the United States entered the war. The Japanese, believing war with the US was inevitable, tried to gain the upper hand with a preemptive strike against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Hoping to cripple the American naval presence in the Pacific and force a settled peace, the Japanese attacked on the morning of December 7th. The American fleet lost several ships, but crucially, the aircraft carriers and repair facilities were largely undamaged. The Japanese had planned for a decisive naval battle with battleships, which ultimately never came. It would be aircraft carriers rather than battleships, which would prove the deciding factor in the Pacific. The United States declared war on Japan, and this was met with declarations by Germany and Italy in accordance with the Tripartite Pact. The US agreed to concentrate on Germany first, with about 2/3 of the American war effort being directed to Europe. Much of that effort came in the form of bombing German factories and infrastructure. Unlike the British, the Americans were unwilling to deliberately target German civilians and launched daytime raids at an attempt for greater accuracy. Post-war American studies of strategic bombing showed only moderate success in crippling German industry. After an invasion of Sicily in 1943 achieved limited success, the Allies finally granted Stalin's wish of opening up a second front on the West in 1944. Operation Overlord was the largest naval invasion in history. On June 6th, known as D-Day, troops from America, Britain, Canada, and 9 other countries stormed the beaches of Normandy and secured a foothold. By September, most of France had been liberated from Nazi occupation. The Allied forces made steady progress with some setbacks in the west, while the Soviet forces advanced in the east. A last-ditch effort by the German army to reverse the tide in the west came in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The counter-offensive failed, and though the cause was utterly hopeless, the Germans fought on for another 5 months. With Berlin about to fall to the advancing Russians, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. Germany formally surrendered on May 8th, 1945, ending the war in Europe. In the Pacific, the United States adopted a strategy of island hopping. Rather than trying to take everything, the US would invade only the islands on the most direct route to Japan. Naval bombers and submarines wreaked havoc on Japanese shipping lanes, crippling supply lines and preventing much-needed raw materials from reaching Japan. Unlike the Allies in the Atlantic, no serious effort was made by the Japanese to counter submarine raids. By the summer of 1944, the United States had captured Guam and Saipan, providing a base for raids on the Japanese home islands. While the United States had been reluctant to attack civilians in Europe, no such quarter was given to the Japanese. That the Japanese had struck first led to hardened American attitudes. 120,000 Japanese American citizens were forcibly interned within the United States from 1942 to 1945. On March 9th and 10th, 1945, American B-29 bombers carried out a massive air raid on Tokyo, killing around 100,000 and destroying 1 million homes. With Japan on the brink of collapse in 1945, there was no doubt whatsoever of an Allied victory. For the Japanese, there was no hope of winning, but only of forcing favorable peace terms by making an invasion of Japan as costly as possible. In August 1945, Stalin honored his promise to declare war on Japan, and the Red Army swiftly crushed the Japanese forces in Manchuria. The development of nuclear weapons had begun in August of 1942. It was a major research and development project that cost over $2 billion and took 3 years of dedicated research by many scientists to make a reality. President Harry Truman ultimately made the decision to use atomic weapons. On the 6th of August 1945, an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima. Estimates of the number of deaths range from 90,000 to 140,000. Among the dead were about a dozen American prisoners of war. 3 days later, a second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing up to 80,000. Truman argued that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved thousands, perhaps millions of Japanese and American lives by making an invasion of Japan unnecessary. It has also been argued that an invasion of Japan could have been avoided anyway if the emperor's position was guaranteed. Regardless, Japan offered to surrender on August 15, 1945. In a rare public address to the people, the Emperor of Japan declared, quote, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," end quote. Quite the understatement. The war officially ended on September 2nd, 1945. The war was not just a clash of armies, but entire societies. The Nazis oversaw the systematic murder of Europe's Jewish population from 1941 to 1945. At least 6 million Jews were killed in German concentration camps. Including other persecuted groups, there were up to 11 million victims of the Holocaust. To field such huge armies, the economies of the major powers were centered on wartime production. Millions of American women supported the war effort. 500,000 were employed in aircraft production. You've probably seen some variation of a Rosie the Riveter poster or magazine cover. The image of a young, determined woman declaring, "We can do it," stems from a 1943 issue of the Saturday Evening Post representing the many women who proved they were equals of men in the workplace. Many American women also served in the armed forces, directly performing a variety of supporting roles. Women of the medical corps braved dangerous conditions to treat wounded soldiers just behind the front lines. Other marginalized sections of American society also made important contributions to the American war effort. Native Americans had a unique skill set which was used effectively in the Pacific, dealing with radio transmissions. The security of these transmissions was vital. If the enemy could intercept and understand a message, they would have a major advantage on the battlefield. With tribal languages almost completely unknown outside of North America, Native Americans were ideal candidates for radio operators. The idea was first contemplated in the final months of the First World War. The American Expeditionary Force was able to maintain the element of surprise during the summer offensives of 1918, in part thanks to the efforts of Choctaw and Cherokee signalmen. Just like the Germans in 1918, the Japanese were never able to make much sense of the transmissions made by the code talkers. Navajo and other Native American signalmen developed a sophisticated military vocabulary to make rapid and accurate tactical transmissions under extreme conditions. Code talkers participated in every assault made by the Marine Corps in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. More than 800 transmissions were sent by Navajo signalmen in the first crucial 48 hours of the American invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945. While Native Americans served alongside white soldiers, the same was not true of African American troops. The armed forces did not desegregate until after the war. The most famous African American combat unit of the Second World War was the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, based out of Tuskegee, Alabama, and at a time when Jim Crow laws were enforced in the southern United States, the Tuskegee Airmen overcame racial discrimination to earn the right to fly combat missions. It was believed at the time that African American pilots were inferior to white airmen and not capable of effective leadership. The pilots of the 332nd proved how ill-founded these views were, with an exemplary record of service in World War II. The 6,000 trucks of the Red Ball Express were primarily driven by African Americans and moved thousands of tons of supplies to the front lines in the summer and fall of 1944. In all, about 1.2 million African Americans contributed to the American war effort, laying the foundations for the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. This is one of the great contradictions of the United States, fighting against fascist tyranny with a segregated army. Similarly, the British fought for freedom with the resources of a vast colonial empire. The war brought about many changes, especially in how people saw the world. There are simply too many outcomes to list completely in one video, but some key points are important to note. One of the first priorities for the victorious Allies was to rebuild after years of chaotic destruction. American aid under the Marshall Plan helped the shattered nations of Western Europe to recover. Change was in the air in other parts of the world. At the end of World War II, about 1/3 of the world's population was under colonial rule. A period of decolonization took place in the 1940s and 1950s. To name just a few, India gained independence from Britain in 1947. Indonesia from the Netherlands in 1945, and a very long struggle for freedom began in French Indochina in 1945. To prevent wars by encouraging peace and international cooperation, the United Nations was founded in 1945. In the aftermath of the war, the understanding between the United States and the USSR swiftly broke down. Europe became divided as Eastern European countries came under communist influence. Nowhere was this split more apparent than in the partition of Germany, which lasted until 1989. In 1949, the nuclear monopoly enjoyed by the United States ended when the Soviet Union successfully detonated an atomic bomb. Fear and mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union would not ignite into a full-scale war, but would simmer in the decades-long Cold War. Let's go through a few review questions to see what you remember. 1. What was the Sudetenland crisis about? A. German territorial claims. B. German rearmament. C. The joining of Austria and Germany. D. None of these. The answer is A. German territorial claims. 2. Most of the United States' attention in World War II was against which country? A. Japan. B. Italy. C. Russia. Or D. Germany. The answer is D. Germany. Question number 3. The first atomic bomb was dropped on which Japanese city? A. Tokyo. B. Osaka. C. Hiroshima. Or D. Nagasaki. The answer is C. Hiroshima. Thanks for watching, and happy studying.